Hi, everyone, and welcome to this fascinating conversation on values, AI, and building tech with heart. I am excited to be chatting with Melissa Crawford, who is in New Zealand and is very much someone who has some fascinating insight into this topic. So if you're not familiar with Melissa's work, she's a highly regarded thought leader on the future of work. And has a unique blend of skills that span both people and technology. And for this reason, she has a very unique perspective on the subject of AI, which I know that we're all sort of fascinated with in 2023. And it's certainly something as part of World Values Day that I really wanted to be talking about, which is AI in values. So thank you for joining us, Melissa.
Oh, thanks for having me, Anna. Excited to talk about this too.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting one. We've had to switch to, for those that are watching, we have had to, due to technical difficulty, switch to Zoom from StreamYard. So you are probably potentially watching this as a live stream, but it is actually pre-recorded. However, if you do have questions about the conversations, please still put them in the chat because Melissa and I will still see them, and Melissa can probably answer those as a LinkedIn or a Facebook comment, as opposed to answering them live on the feed. So please do comment and reach out if you have any questions. But my first question for you, Melissa, is we're very much kind of, particularly this year, as I said, we're moving deeper into the world of AI. We've got the headlines have gone, and we're sort of, people are very much adopting AI as part of work and organizations, and even a part of everyday life. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on whether we have a role with AI and what can we teach it as humans.
Yeah, look, I'm so excited for this question because often people think of AI as something that's kind of the machines are learning by themselves and the machines are just creating things themselves. And I think people forget that humans are actually heavily involved in their design and their creation, and definitely can play a massive part. So even if you think about the data sets or the information that AI uses, it scrapes, a lot of that comes from our conversations. It comes from things that it sees in our emails or our communications through social media, etc. And I have to say, sometimes that worries me when I look at some of the ways that people talk to each other in those social media streams, particularly. And you think about, actually, this is some of the information that AI is learning about how we talk to each other and how we communicate to each other. So I often talk to people about thinking about their role in creating much conversations with each other, which will also, set a bit of a better learning path, I guess, for the AI. But also about the people designing it definitely have a role in looking at elements in it around bias and impartiality and some of those things. I actually read a really interesting piece of research that was coming out of I think it was Georgia Institute of Tech, where they were talking about using stories to teach human values to AI, which I thought was really interesting, because if you think about a lot of the different countries around the world, a lot of that kind of cultural element is often taught through storytelling. And so I found that quite interesting to think of that same concept used with artificial intelligence. So through storytelling, just as we teach with kids, the morals of the stories and values can be taught the same way. So I thought that was quite an interesting angle.
That is fascinating, actually, because particularly Indigenous culture, I mean, you and I know in Australia and New Zealand how important storytelling is as
Yeah.
part of that, and everywhere, but in particular that storytelling piece is, yeah, wow. I must please do share that link, and I will share that to the World Values Day pages. I think there'll be a lot of people watching, and also in general interested in that piece of research. That would be fascinating. Thank you for
Yeah,
bringing it up.
sure.
Yeah. We're seeing a lot of organizations build AI sort of process as part of their systems. And it's very much becoming embedded in, I think, a lot of our workflows. In your opinion, what do we need to be wary of? when doing this?
Yeah, I think that sometimes companies think it's a bit of a sort of set and forget. And I think that would probably be the watch out. So uh, once they get it up and running, it's around constant monitoring and constant checking. So, for example, I've seen in the HR space it used in the recruitment area to help streamline people applying for roles. And I often say, how often have you checked different elements? Have you put your own CV in to see whether you are successful getting through on your on a job? Have you looked at the outputs and what's getting stopped? So have started to see whether there's any bias forming through the selection process, etc. So I think that it's if people think of it as not it's put it in and it will now sort of work its way through. You still need to keep an eye on it and update it. And because in technology we always talk about garbage in, garbage out. So we need to make sure that the data that we're putting in there and the checks and things do evolve and change. And you need to make sure that how the AI is thinking, so the algorithms behind it that do all the calculations, we need to make sure that we're tweaking and adjusting those, because humans set those algorithms up in the first place. And sometimes it's actually quite interesting. As we sort of see it go through, we actually realize the biases that we have because we've actually built them into the systems without really thinking about it. So I think it can be a really nice reflection sometimes, almost a bit of a mirror to society around some of the biases that we do have.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. It's I mean, you do read a lot about the embedding in the organizations, but that's a great perspective on that. I'm going to admit to being a little bit of an AI skeptic. I mean, I think ChatGPT on the surface is great. It has some great tools, and I have used it, and by all means will continue to use it. But for those that are skeptical, what would be your advice on how we can approach this new technology?
I would seek to understand would be the first thing. So sometimes we're a bit more fearful or skeptical of maybe things that we don't understand a little bit. So find somebody who does understand it and can maybe explain it a little bit more in a little bit more detail. I do a lot of keynote speaking at a lot of different conferences. I always like to balance it out with some both sides of the story. So you'll often hear these kind of scary elements of AI, and I like to be able to show some of the really positive uses of it and the things that it's helping us with. If you think about even currently in society, we're using AI all the time, and it hasn't been scary. We use AI when we use Google Maps to find our way to a meeting. We use people will talk about a Netflix show that they saw that they really liked that came up through using AI as a suggestion to them. So actually woven into our days constantly, and it's not really that scary. It's actually quite helpful. And there are lots and lots of examples of that, and things where it's absolutely speeding up people's time. You talk about ChatGPT. That's been a really interesting one because it just, as you said, took off, and the numbers reached pretty interesting highs very, very quickly compared to other tools that had been released. I think it was 100 million people in the first month or so, which was pretty impressive. And that's because people are starting to see how you can use it to help you with your own personal productivity. I think that's the interesting change in AI that's coming now. AI has normally been used for the big companies who have the great resources, and now it's starting to come down to every individual. If you've got access to a computer, you've got access to tapping into different AI tools. And so it's readily available. And there are lots of things that it can do to help you. It's just about finding out. And if you find the what's in it for me, that's always the nice little connecting point for people around, oh, actually, this is saving me loads of time. This is saving me preparation time. This is saving me thinking time. This is getting rid of some of the pain points of things that I procrastinate on because I struggled with this. Oh, the AI can actually help me with that. So it's becoming more of a personal assistant than it ever has been before. And I think that's a really interesting transition for people. And even a lot of the technologies like the Microsoft suite, for example, is looking at embedding a lot more of these tools. So Microsoft Copilot, which is due for release in the next couple of months, integrates that sort of ChatGPT technology into the Microsoft Office suite, which again will make it very accessible to people in their daily work.
Absolutely. And it's being integrated into LinkedIn now, being Microsoft owned Microsoft owned ChatGPT and Microsoft Office suite, obviously, and LinkedIn. So that's another thing we're seeing is ChatGPT. I know I have access to a beta test. You can use ChatGPT to write your LinkedIn profile. So I'm not sure that every user has that yet, but yeah, it's certainly there. So it is being integrated and is a lot more accessible. And I'm actually going to give a shout out to, I had a conversation with a LinkedIn connection of mine, actually in Ireland last night, Frank Prendergast, if you're watching. And I think it was something that actually struck me that he said, and I think this is a really relevant comment to this conversation, is that he said he knows quite a lot about AI. And he follows people who also know a lot about AI. And very interestingly, both him and at least one of the other people he follows that he mentioned are AI skeptics. But they're like, okay, I'm skeptical, so I'm going to go in and I'm going to find out what this thing can do and what it does and its limitations. And I think there's maybe two different types of skeptics. There's the skeptic that is like, I don't want nothing to do with it. And then there's the skeptic that's like, well, I'm a little bit wary of this, but I'm going to dive in and actually make sure I fully understand it before, and therefore, are active users of it, yet still skeptical. So I think there's two ways you can maybe look at skepticism.
Yeah. I mean, I'm definitely an optimist. I'm excited about what it could do for us, but I'm definitely very aware that it could also be used for negative purposes, just as a lot of other technologies, if they're in the wrong hands, will be used for the wrong things. So I'm keen for the conversations around what can we do to create some kind of protocol for design of AI that really, because I'm particularly passionate about the human side and the human impacts of this. So that's why I really want people with more sort of people psychology background involved in the development and design of the AI technology, because I really want them to be thinking through the unintended consequences or the kind of behavioral impacts that some of this technology might have.
Yeah, how interesting. Yeah, I think you're right. Yes, we've got a lot to learn, I think, as well.
Yeah.
That does actually spring to mind a question. What AI tools do you use? What are some of your favorite tools that you perhaps use in your business or in life?
Yeah, so a couple of sort of productivity ones, Otter AI, which does sort of transcripts, because I do a lot of interviews with people, or if I'm working on with a company and collecting some information on their processes, I'm often interviewing, so it's quite useful. It sort of transcribes it for you. So it's quite a popular one. Obviously ChatGPT. I try to actually almost train myself to look at my task list and start to say, okay, is there something on there that I can utilize, that I can accelerate? So maybe something where I want to create the first draft of something, or I'm thinking, how do I go about starting that? Let's just see what ChatGPT has to say, just to get you kind of started. So I definitely use it a lot for that. And then on the other side, I'm sort of playing with it a lot in different, particularly people HR technologies, and looking at the AI components of those and how it kind of works through for the people experience part of the workplace.
Yeah, how interesting. Yeah, that's good. It's good, and I think everyone I talk to has one or two other different AI tools that
I mean, if you look at those websites that literally list what the new updated AI tools are constantly, I mean, there's something for everything. And I used to say when we first started using Microsoft Office, if you're doing something that seems like you're doing it the long way, there probably is an easier way. Now that's kind of blown up into a completely different proportion with AI, because it can do a range of different things for you. And as I said, Copilot, I think, is particularly going to be interesting, because that's going to take a lot of pain points. So if you think about Excel, for example, people who may not have the skills to create formulas, or the skills to create pivot tables or charts, or some of those kind of features of Excel, you can literally, like ChatGPT, say, give me a forecast over the next 5 years based off this data, create me a pivot table that will analyze it by month, and just talk to it, and it will create it for you, which will absolutely speed things up for people where that might have been a bit of a painful exercise for them before.
Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah. Certainly changing the way we work, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. But I think, to your point before, if I come back to the kind of values conversation, there isn't a one defined list of values. So if we talk about building AI values into AI, there isn't a list of these are the values that must go into AI, and that sort of shifts a little bit culturally as well. There are, different values for different cultures. So I think that's the hard point. It's not like, oh, great, well, let's just make sure these 4 things are in it, and then we'll be kind of sorted, because people are so nuanced, and our values are so nuanced. So that's, I guess, a bit of a sticking point when you're trying to build things in. And as I said, a lot of how AI is built is by the data that teaches it, and we are a big part of the data that teaches it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, most conflicts, each side of the conflict will say that they are acting on their values. Now, now the opposition to that conflict would argue differently, but certainly.
Yeah.
So I mean, that is, yes, the quandary with AI and values is everyone's values are different. So and what some people see as compassionate is different as well, the way we judge that, if using that as an example of a value.
Yeah, I was reading the other week about a thing called the veil of ignorance concept. Have you heard of that?
I haven't, no.
So, and that's quite useful when you think about training AI. So if let's think of an example. I think one of the examples they used in this thing I was reading was talking about cake, actually. So if I asked somebody to cut pieces of cake for the people in the room, right? If I knew which piece was going to be mine, that I was cutting a piece for me, then I'm not impartial, and I will make that size of that cake small or big depending on what I want it to be. Whereas if I don't know which piece I'm going to end up on, I will cut that cake more sort of evenly and fairly, to make sure it has a better distribution. And so if you think about that, in the concept of building things into AI, you have to be able to have that impartiality to be able to step back and create things that are for the good of all, rather than thinking about any specific angle of yourself that may bias it to whatever your preference is, or thinking about what you may get out of it. So likewise, if I'm in a company and I'm part of setting up the bonus scheme structures, again, if I know that I'm going to be one of the people that's going to benefit from the bonus scheme structures, I'm not going to be impartial. I'm going to help design it, looking at what what's going to be in it for me in that system. You almost need somebody else who's completely impartial and will not have any benefit from that system in order to be able to make it a bit more even. So that's a really interesting kind of angle when we look at building AI, because everybody building elements into it has got some level of influence currently around their particular viewpoint and what they're trying to achieve out of it.
Yeah, it's very true. That's probably a good opportunity for me to kind of ask a question around kind of values in organizations, because I think there is a real push globally, I think, to build purpose-driven organizations, for organizations to establish their values and try and embed them into the culture. I'm curious to get your thoughts, because I've heard you previously discuss this. I'm curious to get your thoughts on how well values are implemented in organizations. And
yeah,
because I know you've got some experience with this, and I'd love to, I want to ask you about that and actually how technology can help it. But first of all, let's have a chat about, what you've seen in your experience when organizations try to embed values. What happens? Does it work?
So I almost dread this question because I know it may upset some people, but
it's okay. We're good with sticky questions.
But my honest perspective is that a number of companies, both ones that I've worked for and ones that I've spent time with, when I've asked employees about their values, they can very rarely list them all, and sometimes there's quite a lengthy number of them. I've seen companies spend a lot of money trying to embed them, but then I've also seen executive teams completely display different behaviors than what the kind of values are. I very much believe in vision and purpose at a company. I definitely believe in that. But I do believe that values are personal, that I have a set of values, you have a set of values, and they are our values. So I do personally feel that there's a little bit of arrogance for a company to say, okay, you're joining our company now, these are your values, and I want to watch how you're displaying these values, when they may be, and mostly are, maybe quite different to what that person's true set of values are. And so then if I'm working at multiple companies over my career, so I'm supposed to suddenly have a set of 30 different values that I've taken on from these different companies, which I think is why you have this disconnect of people not being able to remember them, because they're not their values. I think that a better term is maybe behaviors. I think a company can have expectation on the behaviors they want people to show, absolutely. But I think the word values for me is a bit triggering. I just find that values are very personal, and I don't particularly believe that a person joins a company and their values completely shift. And some, people will say, oh, but we want their values to align. Yeah, that's different. I may have some values and I want to make sure that I connect to the company, but maybe more to their purpose and their objective. But I certainly don't necessarily take on those values as being mine, because I have my own set of values. So that's my controversial view on values. I think values are very important to a person, and people understanding their own values is probably more powerful, actually.
Yeah. And we see organizations getting stuck in, I suppose, what's termed values washing, which is saying there's certain values that are embedded, or perhaps they're founding values that aren't embedded in the organization, which I think is, probably nobody's fault. It just has happened that way. And they're not embedded, but yet claiming that those are values, and then we do get these examples of values washing. So it's a really interesting discussion, and I think probably something that perhaps not, a lot of organizations aren't aware of. I mean, I do work with communities, and they usually have sets of values, and that does influence the sort of rules of online communities and things like that. So they certainly can be helpful, but people will show up with different values, and that is interesting.
Yeah. And I think if you're going to be bold enough to say these are our company values, then you've really got to think about how that's showing up in everything that you do, both on the customer front and on the internal front. And I think it's an exercise often. And some companies will do the better route of getting their people involved to help create the values. So that's obviously better than just the execs or the board saying these are the values. So that's a better approach. But it might be these are the company values, and then it might be, let's do an exercise on your personal values and how do they align to that. So, and hopefully there's an exercise a bit like that before they're even recruited into the company to check that there's kind of an alignment. But I don't necessarily believe that follow-on piece of you having to kind of, that they become your values. I don't sort of see that sitting.
Yeah, it's hard to adopt a different set of values at work and in life, perhaps.
Yeah.
Trickier.
Every couple of years when you change.
Sorry.
I was just saying, and especially if you're changing roles every couple of years and
Yes.
having to tag on an extra 5 to 7 values, or 20 odd in one company's case.
One's always going to come first, aren't they?
Yeah.
Do you think technology can better help us embed values in organizations?
I do actually. I've seen some really interesting stuff in that space. So I think technology could hold us more accountable.
Mm-hmm.
So, we could have particular values, even if I look at it from the individual's level. So say if you have particular values, technology may be able to give you some data to reflect back on where you actually may not be showing up to those values. So, if it's looking at the way that you communicate with your team, the way that you communicate with people around you, it may say, look, this is what you've said is really important to you. And we've noticed that the tone of your emails, or we've noticed this has actually doesn't reflect that, or you've said that inclusion's a really big part of your value system, but yet we've noticed in your meetings that you very rarely call on this person's opinion, you very heavily focus on this person's opinion, etc. So I think there could be some really interesting ways of being held accountable to those values that could come through technology, and give you little nudges, little reminders to say, hey, we've seen some, and again, on the positive, it could say, hey, we saw a great example of your care value by the way you've been looking after this team member lately, etc. So, I think it could do those kind of little adjustments, and because often your manager or your team may not give you the feedback to kind of mirror back what you're portraying sometimes, and so technology can be a little bit easier than that, because as we know, if a human tries to give you that feedback, you can get quite defensive, or it could be quite upsetting, and also very much depends on the delivery of that and how they tell you, and whether you respect them or not, or trust them, and etc. There's so many layers to them giving you that feedback. Whereas if the technology was able to say, hey, here's what we've noticed, we've analyzed this over the last 6 months, here's the data. It doesn't come with emotion, it doesn't come with judgment, it's just saying, hey, here's what we noticed. I think that could be quite powerful, because you can't argue that.
No, that's true.
Yeah.
And sometimes it does need to be delivered with perhaps some compassion, some human compassion, but other times, yes.
I want to be writing those prompts. I want to be putting the humanness around those so that it's delivered in a nice way. But but I think it could be quite useful from that front. It's a bit like, people thought that they were quite active and then they have technology that tells them how many steps they do a day. And they realize, oh, actually, I don't move as much as I thought I do. I'm actually, on work meetings a lot of the time, so I need to up my steps. So that's given you a data point of feedback that you can then choose whether to act on or not. So I think it could be quite useful in that way, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's really interesting, and it'd be fascinating as AI tools do get further embedded into organizations, how that does shift in the way teams are run, and all sorts of things. So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
We're probably coming to the end of this conversation. I know we're a bit getting a bit short for time, but I did want to ask one question, that because World Values Day is coming up on the 19th of October, is there a value that stands out for you, that one of your values that either you run your business by or that you kind of live by personally? Can you share one of your values and how you put that into action?
Sure. So I think the first one that comes to mind is curiosity. So, and I've packaged this value in a number of different ways, but it's around learning, curiosity, and kind of growing. But I think that's a large part of how I work personally and in my business. So I'm very curious about things. If I don't understand something, I'm curious about it. If someone's got a different opinion to me, I'm curious about that. If somebody comes from a different culture, I'm curious to understand the nuances of their culture. So, and obviously in my work, I'm very curious about the latest psychology or technology trends or future of work kind of research. So for me, that's always been kind of open and having that kind of, I guess, growth mindset that I'm. It doesn't bother me if somebody has a different opinion. I'm really just curious to understand how that was formed, and I'm also very willing to change my perspective on things if I learn new information that kind of adjusts my viewpoints. So yeah, I love learning like that. That's probably my favorite part of me as a person and me and my job. So it's definitely one of those values that's 24/7, not just a work or home element.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you very much. Melissa, I really appreciate your time and your knowledge and your curiosity. So thank you for this conversation and for the work that you're doing. For those that have watched and have a question for Melissa, please do pop it in the chat below. We will be answering questions long after the pre-recorded live goes live. And please pop them in there, or I'm sure that she'd be happy to receive a message from anyone who's got some insight or some questions around any of this conversation. So thanks again, Melissa, and I will.
Thanks, Anna.
Yeah, and it's been a really, really interesting conversation, and I will see everyone else for our next conversation coming up. I think next week. Just keep an eye out on the pages for this Values Day live conversation series. It's been some fascinating ones so far, and more to come. Thanks, everyone.